I am Zuri, 35 years old, and my brother sent me a list of 5 demands I had to obey just to earn a seat at his wedding. Straighten my hair, stay silent, and pay a $25,000 bar tab, or I would be uninvited. He told me to complete them so I could be worthy of standing next to his new high society family. I simply laughed, booked a one-way ticket to Bali, and arranged one final wedding gift. When he opened that velvet box in front of all his elite guests, his face went completely white. Before I share my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind your toxic family exactly who they are messing with. I was sitting in my downtown corner office reviewing the final closing documents for a luxury commercial plaza when the email chime echoed through the quiet room. The sender was Jamal, my younger brother, the undisputed golden child of our family. Carbon copied on the message was Chloe, his white, supposedly high society fiancée. The subject line read simply, "Conditions for your attendance." I leaned back in my leather chair, taking a slow sip of my coffee, and read the first line out loud to my empty office. Demand 1, straighten your hair. Chloe's family finds your traditional locks too aggressive and militant for a formal country club setting. I reached up and touched my hair. My locks were my crown, perfectly maintained and falling past my shoulders. They were the very same locks I wore when I sat at a boardroom table and successfully negotiated a $40 million property acquisition just last Tuesday. But to my brother and his future wife, my identity was nothing but an embarrassment to be ironed out to make their guests comfortable. I kept reading, the audacity escalating with every single word. Demand 2, wear a neutral beige dress and sit at table 24 near the kitchen doors. We cannot have you distracting from the bridal party aesthetics. Demand 3, under no circumstances are you to hand out your business cards or discuss your real estate development work. Chloe's father is a highly respected property tycoon, and it would be deeply inappropriate and intimidating for you to boast about your little projects around him. My little projects. I had literally reshaped the commercial skyline of this city, while Jamal was still calling our parents to cover his car insurance premiums. But my entire career was being reduced to an intimidating hobby, so his future father-in-law would not feel emasculated. Demand 4, do not speak to Chloe's extended family, unless they initiate the conversation first. We need to maintain a certain standard of elegance and respectability. And finally, Demand 5. Since you are not participating in the bridal party, your mandatory sisterly contribution to the wedding will be covering the open bar invoice. The attached total is $25,000. Please have the check ready by Sunday dinner. Complete these conditions, and maybe you will be worthy of standing beside us on our special day. I stared at the glowing screen. A normal sister would have broken down in tears. A normal person would have fired back a furious, emotionally charged email demanding an immediate apology for the blatant disrespect. But I was not just any sister. I had spent the last decade building a real estate empire from the ground up, while my parents Yolanda and Calvin babied Jamal and polished their flawless church-going community image. My mother Yolanda was the head of the church hospitality committee, a woman who measured our family's worth entirely by what the congregation thought of us. My father Calvin was a man who believed a son could do no wrong, and a daughter should simply be quiet and agreeable. They had always treated me like an outsider because I refused to shrink myself to fit their rigid, respectable mold. Jamal had learned early on that he could exploit this dynamic, knowing my parents would always demand that I be the bigger person and fund his mistakes to protect the family name. I did not cry. I did not type a single word in response. I simply hit print. I listened to the crisp sound of the paper sliding out of the machine, folded the email neatly, and slipped it into my designer handbag. I grabbed the keys to my car and headed for the elevator. It was Sunday afternoon, which meant my parents were hosting their traditional post-church dinner at their house. Jamal and Chloe would definitely be there waiting for my reaction, waiting for me to bow down and hand over the money to buy their conditional love. I was absolutely going to hand them a check for exactly $25,000. But what my arrogant brother and his entitled fiancé did not know was that this check was a carefully laid trap. As I walked out to the parking garage, I dialed my wealth manager. I instructed him to put a strict federal fraud watch on the specific routing number Chloe had listed on that catering invoice. I smiled as I started the engine. They wanted me to fund their perfect high society illusion, but that check was about to trigger an absolute avalanche, one that would strip away every last piece of their fake lives. The heavy oak front door of my parents' house was unlocked as usual for Sunday dinner. I pushed it open and the smell of candied yams and roasted chicken hit me instantly. Along with it came the sound of polite artificial laughter echoing from the formal dining room. I did not bother taking off my coat. I marched straight down the hallway with my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. When I turned the corner into the dining room, the picture-perfect scene was fully assembled. My mother Yolanda was wearing her Sunday church suit and beaming at the head of the table. My father Calvin was pouring wine. And there sat Jamal, my golden child brother, next to his fiancée Chloe. Chloe was wearing a pale pink cashmere sweater that probably cost more than her car, and she was laughing at some joke Jamal just made. I did not say a single word. I walked directly up to Jamal and slammed the printed email right onto his plate. The paper landed square in the middle of his macaroni and cheese. A splash of cheese sauce leaped up and splattered directly onto the collar of his crisp white linen shirt. Chloe gasped loudly. Her hand flew up to her chest as if I had just pulled a weapon on them. Jamal jumped back and his chair scraped violently against the floor. "What is wrong with you?" Jamal shouted, grabbing a cloth napkin to wipe his shirt. "You come in here acting loud and ghetto for absolutely no reason. You are completely unhinged." I stared down at him and kept my voice completely level. "Loud and ghetto?" I asked. "Is that what I am? Was I loud and ghetto 10 years ago when I worked double shifts at the call center to pay your fraternity dues? Was my money ghetto when Dad's business took a hit and you were crying in my dorm room because you were about to be evicted from your luxury campus apartment? You certainly did not mind my ghetto money back then, little brother." The entire table went dead silent. Jamal's face turned a deep shade of crimson. He opened his mouth to speak, but my mother intervened before he could form a word. Yolanda stood up and smoothed down her skirt with trembling hands. "Zuri, stop this right now," she demanded. Her voice was tight with that familiar manufactured panic she always used when the family image was threatened. "You are making a scene over nothing. Your brother is under a lot of stress. Just tame your hair for one day and pay the bar tab. Is that really so hard? Chloe's family comes from generational wealth, Zuri. We cannot have your stubborn attitude making us look like we do not know how to act in high society." I turned to look at my mother. "Tame my hair." I repeated the words slowly. I let the absolute absurdity of her statement hang in the heavy air of the dining room. "My father." Calvin slammed his fist on the table, rattling the crystal wine glasses. "Listen to your mother," he barked. "Jamal is marrying into an important family. Chloe's father is a major player in the commercial real estate game. We are not going to let your pride ruin this alliance. You need to fall in line, put on a beige dress, and do what your brother asked. It is just $25,000. You can afford it with all those little real estate projects you are always bragging about." I looked at the four of them. My brother, who felt entitled to my bank account. The fiancé, who looked at me like I was the help. And my parents, who were perfectly willing to crush my dignity just to impress a bunch of strangers they deemed superior. For a brief second, the old Zuri, the daughter who just wanted her parents to be proud of her, felt a sharp sting of betrayal. But the new Zuri, the woman who had clawed her way to the top of the commercial real estate world, saw exactly what this was. It was a business transaction. And I always win my business transactions. I did not argue. I did not scream or throw a tantrum. I took a deep breath, reached into my designer handbag, and pulled out my checkbook. The silence in the room was deafening as I unclicked my solid gold pen. I leaned over the table right next to Jamal's ruined plate and filled out the date. I wrote Chloe's name on the payee line. I filled in the amount of $25,000 and signed my name with a flourish. I ripped the check from the booklet with a sharp and satisfying tear. I held it out. Chloe did not even hesitate. She snatched the check from my fingers with a terribly smug smile spreading across her face. She looked at Jamal triumphantly, as if she had just successfully trained a disobedient dog. "Have the wedding of your dreams," I said smoothly, while looking directly into Chloe's eyes. I turned around and walked out of the dining room without another word. I could hear my mother sighing in relief behind me and already apologizing to Chloe for my dramatic entrance. I pushed the heavy oak front door open and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. The moment the door clicked shut behind me, my phone was already in my hand. I dialed the direct line to my wealth manager and he answered on the second ring. "Marcus, I need you to do exactly as I say," I instructed as I unlocked my car. "A check for $25,000 is going to be deposited into an account soon. I need you to flag the receiving routing number and track every single financial record attached to it." I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine while a cold and calculated smile formed on my face. They thought they had put me in my place. They thought they had won, but they had absolutely no idea that I had just handed them the exact rope they were going to use to hang themselves. The heavy silence of my luxury vehicle was the perfect contrast to the screaming match I had just left behind. I drove away from my parents' suburban neighborhood with my grip tight on the leather steering wheel. My mind replayed the disgusting smugness on Chloe's face as she snatched that $25,000 check from my fingers. She actually believed she had put the loud, aggressive black sister in her place. She thought she had established dominance. By the time I pulled into the underground parking garage of my downtown office building early Monday morning, my anger had cooled into something much more dangerous: pure calculated strategy. I stepped out of the private elevator and strode across the immaculate marble floor of Zuri Holdings. The panoramic windows of my corner office overlooked the city skyline, a skyline I was actively reshaping. My executive assistant, David, was already waiting at my desk with my morning espresso and the daily briefing. I bypassed the coffee entirely. I reached into my bag, pulled out a digital copy of the catering invoice Chloe had shoved in my face yesterday, and handed it to him. "The routing number at the bottom of this invoice is supposed to go directly to a prestigious event caterer," I told David, tapping my manicured nail against the printed digits. "But I know corporate accounts, and I know shell companies. Run a full asset and liability check on Chloe's father. Cross-reference this exact routing number with their family trust. Chloe claims it is a generational wealth account. Let us see exactly what kind of wealth my brother is marrying into." David took the paper, his professional demeanor never wavering, and disappeared out the glass doors. I spent the next 2 hours reviewing commercial blueprints, but my mind was laser-focused on the looming destruction of my brother's carefully constructed illusion. Jamal had always been blind to reality. He was so blinded by his desperate need to fit into spaces that did not want him, so eager for proximity to whiteness and old money, that he never stopped to verify if the gold was actually painted plastic. My parents were just as guilty. Yolanda and Calvin were perfectly willing to crush their own daughter's dignity just to secure an alliance with a family they deemed superior. An hour later, David walked back into my office holding a thick manila file. He did not say a word. He just slid the paperwork across my glass desk. His expression was a mix of absolute shock and professional restraint. I opened the file. I read the first page, then the second. A low chuckle escaped my throat, vibrating through the quiet room until it erupted into a full, genuine belly laugh. Generational wealth was the biggest lie of the century. Chloe's family was completely, irreversibly bankrupt. The dossier laid out a financial bloodbath that would make a rookie investor cringe. Her father had not closed a legitimate real estate deal in a decade. He was stripped of his commercial broker license 6 years ago for defrauding investors in a suburban strip mall development. Their massive estate in the suburbs, the one my parents constantly raved about, was leveraged to the absolute hilt, with 3 separate foreclosure notices filed in the last 12 months alone. I flipped to the bank routing information. The account Chloe gave me did not belong to a luxury catering service. It belonged to an offshore debt consolidation firm. They were not letting Jamal marry into their elite circle. They were using my arrogant golden child brother as a human shield against their creditors. They needed that $25,000 check to keep the bank from seizing their cars before the wedding day. I leaned back in my chair and pulled the wedding invitation from my drawer. I studied the elegant gold embossed calligraphy. The reception was booked at the Sterling Estate, the most exclusive, hyper-expensive country club and event venue in the state. Chloe had bragged endlessly at Sunday dinners about how her father's elite connections secured the date, how the waiting list was 5 years long, unless you knew the right people. She claimed it was a venue that people like me would never be able to access. A sharp knock on the glass door interrupted my thoughts. David stepped back into the office, this time carrying a bright red legal folder. He placed it directly on top of the bankruptcy reports. Zuri, the final wire transfers went through this morning, David said, a knowing smirk playing on his lips. The closing papers just cleared escrow. You are officially the sole owner of the Sterling estate. I ran my fingers over the embossed red leather of the closing portfolio. I had initiated the commercial buyout of the struggling country club 6 months ago, long before Chloe even mailed her invitations. Chloe and Jamal thought they had humiliated me. They thought they had forced me to pay for the privilege of sitting in the shadows of their high society spectacle. They demanded I wear beige and hide my identity just to walk through the doors. But they were about to walk into my house. Excellent work, David, I said, smiling as I opened the red folder to admire the deed bearing my signature. Pull the entire wedding manifest for this weekend. Every vendor, every invoice, every guest list. It is time to clean house. The silence in my office felt electric after I ended the call with Jamal. I stared out at the sprawling city skyline through my panoramic windows and let the reality of the situation settle in. The math was completely fractured. If Chloe and her supposedly elite family were buried under federal tax liens and actively dodging the government, how on earth were they paying for a wedding that easily cost $250,000? The Sterling estate did not take promises. The floral arrangements alone at a venue like that would require a $50,000 deposit. Someone was bleeding cash at an alarming rate, and I had a terrible sinking feeling I knew exactly who the victims were. I picked up my phone and dialed Marcus, a senior vice president at the regional commercial bank my parents had used since I was in elementary school. Marcus and I had collaborated on several massive downtown developments, and he owed me a significant favor for steering a highly lucrative municipal contract his way last quarter. I completely bypassed the small talk when he answered. I asked him to run a discreet internal review on my parents' accounts, citing serious concerns about elder financial abuse. Marcus hesitated at first, bringing up privacy protocols, but I quickly reminded him that I was listed as the secondary executor on their estate, and that time was of the essence. 10 minutes later, my secure line rang. Marcus sounded physically sick when he spoke. Zuri, he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Your parents executed a second mortgage on their home exactly 3 weeks ago. They also fully liquidated Calvin's entire retirement portfolio. The early withdrawal penalty fees alone were astronomical. I gripped the edge of my glass desk so hard my knuckles turned white. My parents had spent 30 years paying off that house. My father had guarded that retirement account with his life. He was a proud man who worked endless hours to build his safety net. I vividly remembered him refusing to help me with my first semester of college tuition because tapping into his savings was deemed too risky. But for Jamal, the rules suddenly vanished. I asked Marcus exactly where the money went. He read the transfer logs to me line by line. The funds were wired directly into an LLC controlled solely by Jamal, and from there the money trail turned into a blatant crime scene. Jamal wired $75,000 directly to the IRS to release a lien on the property owned by Chloe's father. Another $80,000 went straight to luxury wedding vendors. Jamal had pitched our parents the lie of a lifetime. He had clearly convinced them he was investing their life savings into a guaranteed commercial real estate development with Chloe's father. He sold them the ultimate dream of generational wealth and high society access. Instead, my golden child brother was quietly bankrolling a family of white-collar criminals. He was buying his way into a fake elite circle using my parents' blood, sweat, and future security. A cold and sharp rage settled deep in my chest. My parents had looked me in the eye and called me a difficult, stubborn embarrassment just yesterday. They had commanded me to shrink my identity, fix my hair, and hand over my hard-earned money just to impress these people. They were viciously defending the very parasites who were actively draining them dry. I could have called my mother right then. I could have sent the bank statements directly to her phone and shattered their grand delusion before lunchtime. But confronting them now would just give Jamal time to spin another complex web of lies. My parents were so desperate for validation and so obsessed with aesthetics that they would probably try to justify the theft just to save face and keep the wedding intact. A verbal warning would never work on people who were committed to their own deception. They needed to feel the absolute devastation of their choices in real time. They needed to see exactly who they had chosen to blindly trust over their own daughter. I closed the financial spreadsheet on my monitor and leaned back in my chair. I needed to let Jamal run out of rope entirely. I had to let him string up his own disastrous finale. Right on cue, my private cell phone lit up. The caller ID displayed the front desk of the Sterling estate. I answered, the leather of my chair creaking slightly as I sat up straight. Miss Zuri, the smooth and professional voice of my new general manager, came through the speaker. I apologize for the interruption, but we have a slight situation developing in the main lobby. I asked him to elaborate. The manager cleared his throat. The groom. For this weekend's wedding, your brother Jamal is currently standing at my desk. He is attempting to pay the final $15,000 catering invoice. The issue is that he has tried 4 different credit cards, and every single one of them has violently declined for insufficient funds. He is currently sweating through his designer shirt and screaming at my front desk staff. The manager paused for a brief moment, waiting for my directive. How would you like me to proceed? I smiled into the phone. The sheer panic in my general manager's voice was entirely justified, but the sound of my brother's fake empire crumbling in the background was absolute music to my ears. I instructed the manager to remain perfectly polite. I told him to offer Jamal a glass of our finest tap water, guide him and his fiancée to the private executive lounge, and inform them that the owner of the Sterling estate was personally coming down to resolve the billing discrepancy. I explicitly ordered the staff not to reveal my name under any circumstances. I wanted to see the look on Jamal's face when the reality of his situation finally caught up with him. I ended the call, grabbed my keys, and walked out of my office. The drive to the Sterling estate took exactly 25 minutes. It gave me plenty of time to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal I had just uncovered. My parents had quite literally mortgaged their future for a son who was currently screaming at a receptionist because his fraudulent funds had run dry. They had handed over the equity of their 30-year family home and drained every cent of my father's retirement savings just to fund a scam. Jamal had manipulated them into bankrolling a bankrupt family of white-collar criminals, and my parents had happily written the checks while calling me a difficult disappointment. They were going to lose everything they had ever worked for, and they had done it with a smile on their faces. I turned onto the long, manicured driveway of the Sterling estate. The property was breathtaking. Massive oak trees lined the cobblestone path leading up to the historic stone mansion. The sprawling green lawns and pristine gardens were exactly the kind of old money aesthetic Chloe and Jamal were desperately trying to buy their way into. I handed my keys to the valet, who immediately stood up straight and greeted me with a respectful nod. I walked through the heavy mahogany front doors and stepped into the grand foyer. The sound of Jamal's voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers before I even rounded the corner. He was pacing back and forth in the private executive lounge, waving his hands in the air and raising his voice at my general manager. Chloe was sitting on a velvet sofa with her arms crossed, looking absolutely furious. I am telling you to run the platinum card one more time, Jamal barked at the manager. The machine is clearly broken. I have thousands of dollars in that account. Do you have any idea who I am? My future father-in-law is a major real estate tycoon. If you do not process this catering invoice right now and stop embarrassing me in front of my fiancé, I will have your job by tomorrow morning. I stepped into the doorway of the lounge. My heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, drawing every eye in the room. "The machine is not broken, Jamal," I said smoothly. "The machine is working perfectly. The problem is that your accounts are completely empty." Jamal spun around. His face flushed a deep, violent shade of red the second he saw me. He looked from me to the general manager, utterly confused as to why I was standing in the private lounge of an exclusive country club. Chloe stood up, her face twisting into a scowl. "What are you doing here?" Jamal demanded, marching toward me. "Did Mom and Dad send you?" "Listen to me very carefully, Zuri. I do not have time for your bitter, jealous attitude today. My bank made a stupid clerical error and froze my funds. You need to pull out your checkbook right now and pay this $15,000 catering balance. If you ruin my wedding weekend because you are too stubborn to help your own family, I swear to God I will never speak to you again." I looked at my brother. I looked at the sweat forming on his forehead and the absolute panic hiding just behind his arrogant demands. He was still trying to play the golden child, still expecting me to clean up his mess and fund his delusions. "I am not here to pay your catering bill," I replied, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "And your bank did not make a clerical error. Your accounts are empty because you already wired $80,000 to luxury wedding vendors and handed $75,000 directly to the IRS to pay off the tax liens on Chloe's father's foreclosed properties. I know exactly where the money went, Jamal. I know you manipulated Mom and Dad into taking out a second mortgage and draining their retirement funds to pay for a fake life you cannot afford." Jamal stopped dead in his tracks. The color completely drained from his face. Chloe let out a sharp gasp, her eyes darting nervously toward the door as if she was preparing to run. "You are lying," Jamal stammered, his voice dropping to a panicked whisper. "You have no idea what you are talking about. You are just trying to embarrass me in front of the venue staff." I turned to my general manager, who was standing quietly with his hands folded behind his back. "Thomas," I said clearly, "what is the current outstanding balance for the Blackwood wedding reception?" The manager looked directly at Jamal, then turned to me with a polite bow. "The remaining balance for the catering and floral arrangements is exactly $15,400, Ms. Zuri. As the legal owner of the Sterling estate, how would you like me to handle the delinquent account?" The silence that followed was absolute. Jamal's jaw went completely slack. Chloe sank back down onto the velvet sofa as if the air had been knocked out of her lungs. They both stared at me in horrified realization. "I own this venue, Jamal," I said, taking a slow step toward him. "You demanded that I sit near the kitchen doors and hide my identity so I would not intimidate your bankrupt in-laws. You demanded that I pay a massive bar tab just to earn a seat at a table in my own building. So here's how we are going to proceed. I am officially canceling your wedding contract for non-payment. You and your scam artist fiancé have exactly 5 minutes to leave my property before I have security throw you out." I stood in the doorway watching Jamal sweat and panic. The words were right on the tip of my tongue. I wanted to march into that room, announce my ownership, and have security throw them out onto the street. It would have been deeply satisfying to watch Chloe cry as her dream wedding collapsed in real time. But as I looked at my brother frantically refreshing his empty banking app, a much colder, sharper realization washed over me. Kicking them out today was too easy. It would allow them to spin a narrative. Jamal would play the victim, claiming a cruel, aggressive sister ruined his day, and my parents would coddle him while scrambling to find another venue. No, I needed a public spectacle. I needed them trapped in their own lies with an audience of their supposed high society peers watching. I caught Thomas's eye and gave a subtle shake of my head. I took a slow step backward into the quiet hallway, retreating into the shadows before Jamal or Chloe could spot me. Thomas immediately excused himself from the irate couple and stepped out to join me. "Change of plans." "Thomas," I said softly, keeping my eyes fixed on the lounge door. "Do not cancel the contract today. Go back in there and tell them our payment processing system is experiencing a temporary network outage. Apologize for the inconvenience. Tell him the system declined his cards automatically due to a glitch on our end, but he has until exactly noon on Friday to bring a certified wire transfer for the final balance. If the funds are not secured by Friday at noon, the doors stay locked on Saturday." Thomas smiled, a glint of professional understanding in his eyes. He nodded, smoothed his lapels, and walked back into the lounge. I stayed hidden in the corridor, listening as Thomas delivered the fabricated excuse. The immediate heavy sigh of relief that escaped Jamal's chest was almost comical. I heard Chloe's shrill voice immediately soften into fake sweetness as she accepted the apology. Within 3 minutes, they were rushing out of the side exit, desperate to escape before the imaginary system came back online and exposed their complete lack of funds. Once the heavy double doors clicked shut behind them, I finally stepped out into the grand foyer. The air suddenly felt lighter. I spent the next hour taking a slow, private tour of my newly acquired property. The Sterling estate was a masterpiece of classic architecture. I walked through the sweeping botanical gardens, running my hands over the imported marble balustrades. I moved into the main reception hall, my heels echoing in the massive empty space. The grand ballroom was spectacular. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a private lake, and massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings like frozen rain. I stood dead center on the polished hardwood dance floor and visualized the absolute circus that was about to take place in this exact room. I pictured my mother Yolanda, dressed in her most expensive gown, parading around these tables and boasting to her church friends about her son marrying into old money. I imagined my father Calvin swirling a glass of top-shelf bourbon, congratulating himself for securing a powerful business alliance. I saw Chloe's father, a disgraced, unlicensed fraudster, pretending to be a real estate tycoon while secretly dodging federal tax collectors. And there would be Jamal standing at the altar in a custom tuxedo, playing the role of the wealthy, successful groom, entirely funded by the stolen equity of our parents' 30-year mortgage. They were all going to walk through my doors, eat food prepared in my kitchens, and dance on my floors, completely oblivious to the fact that they were standing in the palm of my hand. They had spent my entire life telling me I was not refined enough, not quiet enough, not respectable enough for their world. Now I owned the very stage they were using to perform their fake superiority. It was a psychological victory so profound it practically hummed in my veins. I walked over to the towering windows and looked out over the manicured lawns. I was mentally reviewing the logistics of Friday's deadline when my private cell phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a text message from Jamal. The sheer audacity of his name popping up made me laugh out loud. I swiped open the message and read his words. "Hey Zuri, sorry about the weird check glitch earlier. Chloe's dad is moving some massive offshore funds around for a new commercial acquisition, and the bank put a temporary hold on the account. It is totally normal for high net worth transfers. Anyway, the Sterling estate needs the final $15,000 for the catering by Friday. Can you just wire it to them? Chloe is super stressed about the delay, and I am swamped, thanks." I stared at the glowing screen, absolutely mesmerized by his delusion. He was still lying. Even after his cards were declined, even after draining our parents' retirement accounts, he was still trying to play the big shot. He honestly believed I was just a bitter, naive sister who would blindly open her checkbook to buy his conditional love. He thought he was playing me like a fiddle. He thought he was the smartest person in the room. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face as I stood in the middle of my multi-million-dollar ballroom. I tapped the screen and typed my response with deliberate, measured keystrokes. "Sure, Jamal. Do not worry about a thing. I will make sure the venue gets exactly what it deserves." I hit send, locked my phone, and slipped it back into my pocket. The trap was set, the doors were locked, and there was absolutely no way out. I was still standing in the exact center of the grand ballroom when my cell phone vibrated in the palm of my hand. The screen lit up with Jamal's name. It had been less than 60 seconds since I sent my text message confirming that the venue would get exactly what it deserved. Jamal, completely blinded by his own arrogance, interpreted my words exactly how he wanted to. He actually believed I was eagerly wiring $15,000 to cover his bounce catering check just to get back into his good graces. I stared at the glowing screen for a brief moment. A predator does not just snap the trap shut at the first sign of movement. A smart predator waits until the prey is completely comfortable, entirely convinced they are the one in control. I opened the secondary audio application on my private phone, tapped the bright red record button, and swiped the screen to answer the call. See, Zuri. Was that really so difficult? Jamal's voice boomed through the speaker, echoing slightly in the massive empty ballroom. He sounded utterly triumphant, dripping with that fake, magnanimous tone he always adopted when he thought he had won. I told Mom you would eventually come to your senses. You always have to make things so dramatic and difficult before you finally fall in line. I let out a slow, perfectly measured sigh. I had to play this flawlessly. I needed to feed him the exact narrative his fragile ego was starving for. I dropped my voice an octave, replacing my usual sharp executive tone with something soft, defeated, and submissive. You are right, Jamal, I said quietly, pacing slowly across the polished hardwood floor. I think I was just acting out of insecurity. I drove past the Sterling Estate earlier today, and the venue is just so incredibly exclusive. I know my little real estate projects could never compete with the kind of high society wealth Chloe's family has. I guess I was just feeling intimidated. The silence on the other end of the line lasted only a second before Jamal let out a loud, condescending chuckle. He swallowed the bait whole. Listen, Zuri, do not beat yourself up too much, Jamal said, his voice oozing with unearned superiority. We cannot all operate at this level. You have done okay for yourself with your little office buildings, but you are playing in the minor leagues. Chloe's family operates on an international scale. Her father practically runs the commercial district. You just have to learn your place and stop trying to compete with real money. I stopped walking and stared up at the massive crystal chandeliers hanging above my head. The sheer absurdity of him lecturing me about real money while standing inside a multi-million-dollar venue that I had just purchased with my own cash was almost too delicious to handle. But I needed more. I needed the full confession on tape. I am honestly in awe of your financial strategy, Jamal, I murmured, injecting a tone of genuine wonder into my voice. I just do not understand how you pulled this off. Funding a $250,000 wedding at a venue like this on your salary is incredible. And you mentioned a commercial acquisition earlier. How are you affording to invest in such a massive project with Chloe's father? You must be a financial genius. That was the exact push he needed. Jamal had spent his entire life being coddled and praised for doing the bare minimum. My parents had treated every minor accomplishment of his like a monumental victory, while treating my actual empires as mere hobbies. He was desperate to prove he was the brilliant businessman he pretended to be, and he simply could not resist the opportunity to gloat to the sister who actually was one. You have to take big risks to sit at the big table, Zuri, Jamal boasted. The arrogance in his voice was so thick it was suffocating. You are too conservative. You work yourself to death trying to build things from the ground up. I work smarter. I realize that Mom and Dad have been sitting on a gold mine for 30 years doing absolutely nothing with it except going to church and playing it safe. I gripped the phone tighter, my nails digging into the protective case. What do you mean? I asked softly. I mean, I pitched them the opportunity of a lifetime. Jamal laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that completely lacked any warmth or respect for our parents. Dad is so obsessed with looking successful and leaving a legacy, it was almost too easy. I told him Chloe's dad was giving us exclusive ground floor access to a guaranteed commercial development. I told them if they leveraged the equity in the house and liquidated his retirement accounts, we would triple their money in 2 years. And they just handed it over to you, I prompted, ensuring his admission was crystal clear on the recording. Of course they did, Jamal sneered. They trust me. They know I am marrying into a completely different tax bracket. They wired the funds directly into my LLC last week. They think it is sitting in an escrow account gathering interest for the big development project. But you used it for the wedding, I asked. I used it to handle business, Jamal corrected sharply, his ego taking the wheel completely. Chloe's dad is letting me invest Mom and Dad's retirement in his new commercial project. I'm going to be a millionaire, Zuri. While you're hustling for pennies, you'll be begging me for a job. There it was, the absolute smoking gun. He had just explicitly confessed to defrauding our parents, draining their life savings, and funneling their money into a bankrupt fraudster's offshore accounts, all while fully believing he was a master investor. He viewed Yolanda and Calvin not as parents to be respected, but as gullible marks to be exploited. He was actively destroying their future to buy his way into a fake elite circle, and he was absolutely proud of it. The silence stretched for several seconds as I let his vile words burn themselves into the digital recording file. The sheer lack of remorse was staggering. My parents had looked me in the eye just 24 hours ago and told me I was a difficult, stubborn embarrassment who needed to learn how to act. They had demanded I bow down to this exact brother and his bankrupt fiancée. They were viciously defending the very parasite who was actively bleeding them dry. "Are you still there?" Jamal snapped, clearly annoyed by the quiet reception to his grand villain monologue. "Just make sure that wire transfer clears by tomorrow. I have a rehearsal dinner to attend to, and I do not have time to hold your hand through a simple bank transaction." I took a slow, deep breath. My posture was perfectly straight, my expression cold and unmoving. I looked out the grand ballroom windows at the sprawling estate that legally belonged to me. "Thank you, Jamal," I said, my voice dropping its submissive tone and returning to its natural icy timbre. "You have given me exactly the inspiration I needed." Before he could register the sudden shift in my demeanor, I pulled the phone away from my ear and hit the end call button. I immediately pressed stop on the recording application. I watched the progress bar spin for a fraction of a second before the audio file safely stored itself. I did not stop there. I immediately uploaded the file to 3 separate heavily encrypted cloud servers and forwarded a secure copy directly to David at the office. I slipped the phone into my designer blazer pocket. The silence of the ballroom returned, wrapping around me like a comforting blanket. I now held the absolute power to destroy Jamal's entire world. I had the undeniable, irrefutable proof of his manipulation and fraud. I could send the recording to my parents right now and watch the fallout from afar. But sending an audio file was far too passive for the level of disrespect I had endured. They wanted high society, they wanted drama, elegance, and a public display of wealth. They had spent my entire life trying to make me sit near the kitchen doors. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for. The wedding was in 48 hours. It was time to prepare the perfect execution. I walked out of the grand ballroom and navigated the opulent, quiet corridors of the Sterling estate until I reached the executive management suite. The plush carpeting absorbed the sound of my footsteps, allowing me to enter the outer reception area entirely unannounced. I bypassed the empty administrative desks and walked straight into the sprawling office of my general manager. Thomas was sitting behind a massive glass desk reviewing a stack of catering manifests. He looked up immediately, dropping his gold pen and standing at attention when he saw me cross the threshold. I did not sit down. I walked directly to the center of his desk and placed a sleek matte black box onto the polished glass surface. It was the exact dimensions of a high-end jewelry presentation case lined entirely in crushed midnight velvet. It looked incredibly expensive, deeply elegant, and perfectly suited for a high society wedding gift. I popped the silver clasp and lifted the lid. Thomas leaned forward, his professional curiosity getting the better of him. "We are going to make a slight adjustment to the reception timeline for this Saturday," I told him, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I need you to personally oversee the delivery of this box to the groom. It must be executed with absolute surgical precision." I reached into my designer tote bag and pulled out the first piece of ammunition. It was a stack of legal documents printed on heavy premium bond paper. The top page featured a bright red stamp from the federal government. I laid the papers meticulously inside the velvet box. "These are the official foreclosure notices and federal tax liens for Chloe's father," I explained, smoothing the pages down so the bold red lettering was the first thing anyone would see. They detail exactly how bankrupt her family is, completely exposing the fact that her father lost his commercial real estate license half a decade ago for investor fraud. Thomas blinked his eyes, scanning the top document. He did not say a word, but I could see the shock registering in his rigid posture. I reached into my bag again and pulled out a second stack of paper. These documents were highlighted in bright neon yellow, drawing the eye directly to the massive numerical figures printed across the columns. I placed them neatly on top of the foreclosure notices. These are the certified bank statements and wire transfer logs from my parents' joint accounts. I continued, my tone as clinical as a surgeon holding a scalpel. They prove without a shadow of a doubt that my brother Jamal drained our father's life savings and secretly leveraged a second mortgage on our family home. The highlights show the exact moment Jamal wired $80,000 to your catering department and $75,000 directly to the IRS to pay off the bride's father's delinquent taxes. I looked up at Thomas. His jaw was tight. He was a seasoned hospitality veteran who had managed events for politicians and billionaires, but even he was visibly stunned by the sheer magnitude of the financial carnage sitting in the box. Finally, I pulled out the centerpiece. It was a brand new, ultra-thin iPad. The screen was completely locked down. It had been wiped clean of all applications, stripped of any security passwords, and disconnected from the internet. It had exactly one function. I nestled the silver tablet perfectly into the center of the crushed velvet, right on top of the financial ruin. When you open the cover of this tablet, it automatically plays a single audio file at maximum volume. I instructed tapping the glass screen with my manicured nail. It is a crystal-clear recording of the groom bragging about how he conned his own parents out of their retirement to fund this wedding. It is a full, unedited confession of white-collar fraud delivered in his own arrogant voice. I closed the lid of the black velvet box and snapped the silver clasp shut. The sharp click echoed in the quiet office. I pushed the box across the glass desk until it rested directly in front of Thomas. "Here is the exact protocol," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "You are going to wait until the reception is in full swing. Do not do it during dinner. Let them eat. Let them drink the expensive champagne my parents unknowingly paid for. You wait for the precise moment my father stands up to give the traditional family toast. He is going to raise his glass, demand the attention of the entire room, and give a pompous speech about generational wealth, family legacy, and high society alliances." I took a slow breath, visualizing the room full of elite guests hanging on my father's every word. The very second my father finishes his speech and the room breaks into applause, "You will signal the head waiter," I commanded. The waiter will walk directly to the center of the head table, carrying this box on a silver serving tray. He will place it directly in front of Jamal. He will say it is a special last-minute delivery from the owner of the Sterling estate. Jamal will not be able to resist opening it in front of Chloe and her parents. When he flips the lid, the iPad will activate. The audio will play. The documents will be sitting right there for Chloe's father and my parents to see. I stepped back from the desk and crossed my arms. "Do you understand the assignment, Thomas?" Thomas looked down at the black velvet box resting on his desk. He reached out and traced his finger along the silver clasp. He understood perfectly. He knew that the moment that box was opened, the entire facade would shatter into a million irreparable pieces. The bride's fake wealth would be exposed. The groom's theft would be broadcasted to the entire room. My parents would realize they had bankrupted themselves for a lie. It was going to be an absolute, unmitigated disaster of biblical proportions, and I was orchestrating it from the shadows. Thomas slowly lifted his head. The professional neutral mask he wore for the country club members slipped, replaced by a dark, knowing smirk. "Consider it done, boss," Thomas said, his voice dropping into a tone of absolute loyalty. "The timing will be flawless." I gave him a single approving nod. I turned on my heel and walked out of the executive suite. I did not look back. I strode through the grand lobby of my venue, handed my ticket to the valet, and climbed into my car. The satisfaction radiating through my chest was intoxicating. I had set the fuse. The explosive yield was perfectly calculated. There was nothing left for me to do but step completely out of the blast radius. I drove straight back to my luxury downtown penthouse. The afternoon sun was pouring through my floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm golden glow over the immaculate space. I walked past the sprawling living room, bypassed the kitchen, and headed directly into my massive walk-in closet. The custom mahogany shelves were lined with designer shoes and tailored business suits, but I ignored all of them. I reached up and pulled down my heavy-duty hardshell designer luggage. I unzipped the main compartment and laid it open on the plush center island. My parents had commanded me to pack my bags. They had told me I did not belong. I was simply taking their advice. I grabbed my passport from the safe. I pulled out my silk sundresses, my designer swimwear, and my oversized sunglasses. I packed lightly, efficiently, and with a permanent smile fixed on my face. By the time my family sat down for their catastrophic rehearsal dinner tomorrow night, I would be halfway across the world. I was going to be sitting on a private, sun-drenched beach in Bali, sipping a craft cocktail completely unreachable. Let Jamal handle the high society fallout. I had an island to enjoy. I zipped my hardshell suitcase shut with a satisfying click. The physical act of packing had completely cleared my mind. I walked over to my kitchen island, opened my laptop, and bypassed my usual corporate travel portals. This was not a business trip. This was a liberation. I navigated straight to the Emirates website and booked a first-class suite on the next outbound flight to Denpasar, Bali. The price tag was substantial, but unlike my brother, I actually had the liquid assets to cover it without breaking a sweat or defrauding my relatives. Next, I needed a sanctuary. I found a luxury cliffside villa in Uluwatu that hung suspended over the Indian Ocean. The property featured a private infinity pool, a dedicated staff, and absolute impenetrable privacy. I paid for 2 weeks in full. I did not text my mother my flight details. I did not forward the itinerary to my father. I did not leave a helpful little sticky note on the counter. For the first time in 34 years, I was completely severing the cord. I was stepping off the family stage and leaving them to perform their tragic play to an empty auditorium. I called a premium black car service, grabbed my bags, and locked the door to my penthouse. The drive to the international terminal was incredibly peaceful. I watched the city skyline blur past the tinted windows, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of my family's expectations lifting off my shoulders with every passing mile. They had spent my entire life treating me like an unpaid extra in the Grand Jamal show. I was only expected to speak when spoken to fund their lavish tastes, and to shrink myself so my brother could feel tall. Not anymore. The airport was bustling with evening travelers, but my ticket granted me immediate access to the private first-class check-in. There were no lines, no chaotic crowds, and no screaming grooms trying to pass off declined credit cards. A highly trained attendant checked my luggage, handed me my boarding pass with a warm smile, and personally escorted me to the private elevator leading up to the Emirates lounge. The lounge was a masterclass in quiet luxury. Soft ambient lighting reflected off polished marble surfaces, and the faint sound of a grand piano filled the air. I found a secluded, curved leather booth near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the tarmac. Within seconds, a server appeared and poured me a glass of perfectly chilled vintage champagne. I took a slow sip, letting the crisp bubbles dance on my tongue. I looked down at my watch. It was exactly 5:30 in the evening. Back in my hometown, the chaos was undoubtedly beginning to percolate. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled to start at 6:30 sharp at a high-end steakhouse downtown. I knew exactly what was happening right now. Yolanda was likely standing in front of a mirror, adjusting her pearls and barking orders at my father. Calvin was probably pacing the floor, rehearsing the pompous speech he planned to deliver to Chloe's fraudulent parents. Jamal was undoubtedly sweating through his custom-tailored suit, frantically checking his phone to see if I had magically wired $15,000 into his empty accounts. They were all waiting for me to show up. They were expecting me to walk through the doors of that steakhouse, wearing the drab, shapeless beige dress Yolanda had explicitly ordered me to wear. They were expecting me to have my hair slicked back and hidden to keep my mouth shut, and to quietly hand Jamal a check to save his pathetic facade. I set my champagne flute down on the marble table. I pulled my phone out of my bag and opened my camera app. I looked at my reflection on the screen. I was not wearing beige. I was wearing a striking jewel-toned emerald green silk blouse that contrasted beautifully with my dark skin. My hair was not slicked back or hidden away to make Chloe feel more comfortable. My natural locks were styled perfectly, falling freely past my shoulders, framing my face with absolute confidence. I looked exactly like the wealthy, successful, independent woman my parents had always tried to suppress. I angled the phone to capture the glass of champagne, the luxurious leather booth, and the massive Emirates airplane sitting on the tarmac behind me. I snapped the picture. It was a perfect, unapologetic display of my reality. I opened Instagram, attached the photo, and tagged my location as the International First Class Terminal. I did not write a long emotional caption. I did not air any dirty laundry. I simply typed 3 words: wheels up, unbothered. I hit publish. The photo went live to my thousands of followers, which included dozens of my parents, church friends, my extended family, and of course Jamal. Of course. I set the phone face up on the table and leaned back into the plush leather seating. I took another sip of champagne and watched the seconds tick by on the digital clock on my screen. I knew the exact algorithmic speed at which gossip traveled in my family. I knew it would take less than a minute for someone to see the post process the location tag and realize that the dependable, obedient daughter was currently boarding a flight to the other side of the planet instead of walking into the rehearsal dinner. It took exactly 84 seconds. My phone violently vibrated against the marble table, the harsh buzzing sound shattering the quiet elegance of my booth. The screen flashed bright white. The caller ID displayed Yolanda in large, demanding letters. She was calling back to back, not even letting it go to voicemail before redialing. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the absolute desperation radiating through the digital signal. Finally, I swiped the green button and lifted the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I just listened. "Where are you?" Yolanda screamed through the receiver. Her voice was so shrill and frantic, I actually had to pull the phone an inch away from my ear. The background noise was chaotic, filled with the sound of clinking silverware and murmuring voices. "The rehearsal dinner starts in an hour, and Chloe's mother is already asking why our family is so disorganized. Get here right now, Zuri. We are not doing this tonight." I lowered the phone slightly, pulling it an inch away from my ear as Yolanda's frantic breathing echoed into the quiet luxury of my first-class suite. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, letting the crisp vintage wash over my tongue. The contrast between my current reality and her absolute hysteria was pure poetry. The ambient lighting of the Emirates cabin cast a warm glow over my emerald silk blouse, while my mother was undoubtedly sweating in the crowded, noisy lobby of a downtown steakhouse, terrified of looking bad in front of strangers. "We are not doing anything tonight, Mother," I replied. My voice was completely flat, entirely devoid of the anxiety, guilt, or obedience she was so accustomed to extracting from me. "I am doing exactly what I want to do. You, on the other hand, are currently standing in a restaurant, panicking over a seating chart." Yolanda let out a sharp, offended gasp. "Do not speak to me with that tone, Zuri. You get off that plane right now. You march down to the baggage claim call, a premium car service change, into the beige dress we agreed on, and get to this dinner. Chloe's mother is introducing us to the country club board members tonight. We are sitting at the head table. You are humiliating us in front of high society. You are posting petty photos and making us look like we cannot even control our own family." "High society," I repeated, letting the words roll off my tongue like a bad joke. "Is that what you call a family drowning in federal tax liens and facing multiple property foreclosures?" I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end, but I did not afford her the luxury of interrupting me. "Do not pretend you care about my presence, Mother. You do not care about having your daughter there. You care about your props. You spent the last 6 months handing me an itemized list of demands just to earn the privilege of attending my own brother's wedding. You told me to conform to make you look acceptable." Jamal demanded I straighten my hair, shrink my career lower, my voice, and wear a drab beige dress just to blend into the background. "You assigned me a seat by the kitchen swinging doors so my actual success would not intimidate his fake rich in-laws. You wanted me entirely invisible, but you wanted my wallet wide open." "That is not true," Yolanda stammered. Her voice dropped into a harsh, furious whisper, indicating she had walked into a quiet hallway to hide the argument from her precious guests. "We just asked you to be considerate of their traditions. We asked you to be a team player for your brother's special weekend. You have always been so selfish, Zuri. You always have to make everything about you and your money. You could never just be happy for Jamal. My money is exactly why I am sitting on an outbound flight to Bali, I stated clearly, tracing the rim of my crystal flute. I am going to a place where my money, my natural hair, and my actual identity are respected. I am not going to sit at a back table and pretend to be less than what I am, just so you can play pretend with a family of glorified con artists. And let me make something abundantly clear to you right now. Jamal's credit cards violently declined at the venue this morning. He does not have a dime to his name. He gave your retirement money to Chloe's father to pay off his IRS debt. There was a long, heavy silence on the line. I could hear the faint sound of a jazz band playing in the background of the steakhouse. When Yolanda finally spoke, the denial in her voice was so thick it was almost tangible. "You are lying," Yolanda hissed, her tone venomous. "Jamal is a lead investor. He is securing our financial future. You are just trying to ruin his day because you are bitter and alone. You could not buy a husband, so you are trying to sabotage his." The delusion was breathtaking. Even when presented with the absolute truth, she instinctively shielded the golden child and attacked my character. She was so desperate for the aesthetic of success that she would gladly let Jamal steer them right off a financial cliff as long as he wore a tuxedo while doing it. "I am not ruining anything," I replied smoothly. "Jamal has completely bankrupted himself. He has bankrupted you. I am simply refusing to pay the ransom. If you do not walk through the doors of this restaurant in the next 30 minutes, Zuri, do not ever come back." Yolanda's voice trembled with a mixture of desperate rage and absolute panic. She was delivering her final ultimatum, the one she thought would bring me to my knees. "If you abandon your brother tonight, if you embarrass this family in front of these people, you are dead to us. Do you hear me? You are dead to this family." I leaned my head back against the plush leather headrest and smiled. A genuine, unrestrained smile. The threat of losing them no longer carried any weight whatsoever. It was not a punishment. It was a long overdue release. "You were dead to me the moment you let a broke white family disrespect your own daughter," I replied. I did not wait for her to scream again. I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red button, cutting off her voice instantly. The heavy silence of the first-class cabin rushed back in peaceful and perfect. I immediately swiped down on my screen and engaged airplane mode, severing my connection to the chaos thousands of miles below. The overhead chime sounded clear and bright. The captain's voice came through the intercom announcing our final clearance for departure. I sank deeper into my seat as the massive engines roared to life, the vibrations humming through the floor. The plane accelerated down the runway, pushing me back into the leather cushions, leaving the ruins of my family's fake empire firmly on the ground. The 20-hour flight across the globe was a masterclass in absolute uninterrupted peace. I slept for 8 solid hours in a private lie-flat first-class suite, woke up to a gourmet breakfast prepared by a private chef, and watched 3 consecutive movies without a single demanding, passive-aggressive text message crossing my screen. Stepping off the plane at Ngurah Rai International Airport was like stepping onto another planet. The heavy, suffocating expectations of my family were instantly left behind, completely replaced by the thick, fragrant tropical heat of Indonesia. My private driver was waiting at the terminal. He whisked me away in a climate-controlled luxury SUV, navigating the winding, lush roads up the southern peninsula to Uluwatu. The cliffside villa I had booked was even more spectacular than the architectural photos had promised. The property sat suspended over a dramatic limestone cliff, offering an unobstructed panoramic view of the Indian Ocean. The dedicated villa staff greeted me with cold towels and fresh fruit juice, but I waved off the formal tour. I needed to get straight to the water. I walked into the massive master suite, stripped off my travel clothes, and slipped into a sleek black swimsuit. I walked straight out through the sliding glass doors onto the sun-drenched teak deck. The infinity pool was designed to look as if it spilled directly into the crashing waves hundreds of feet below. I waded into the crystal clear, perfectly heated water, rested my arms along the smooth stone edge, and took a deep cleansing breath of the salt air. The silence was golden. It was time to check the blast radius. I reached over to the shaded patio table, picked up my phone, and turned off airplane mode. I tapped the icon to connect to the villa's high-speed network. For 3 full seconds, nothing happened. The screen remained completely still. Then the device practically convulsed in my hand. The notification chimes bled into one continuous, violent, overlapping ring. Voicemails, missed calls, text messages, and urgent emails flooded my lock screen in a relentless cascade of panic. I watched the little red notification badges tick up with a sense of detached, clinical fascination. 45 missed calls from Yolanda, 18 from Calvin, 32 from Jamal. I opened my mother's text thread first. Reading her messages was like reviewing a psychological case study in parental entitlement and severe denial. The timeline of her texts painted a perfectly chaotic picture. The first few messages were sent during the rehearsal dinner the night before, starting with commanding demands that I show up immediately, escalating into absolute outrage when the dinner ended without my attendance. She accused me of trying to ruin her high society debut. She called me bitter. She called me a disgrace. But then the timeline shifted to Friday morning and the tone pivoted drastically. The anger evaporated completely, replaced by frantic confusion. She texted that Thomas, the venue manager, was refusing to let the luxury floral team onto the property. She was absolutely outraged that her supposed elite status was not enough to bypass a simple payment delay. She demanded that I call my brother, wire him the money, and fix the situation before Chloe's parents found out about the holdup. She still fully believed Jamal was a millionaire experiencing a minor banking glitch. She still expected me to play the obedient safety net. I swiped out of her thread and opened Jamal's messages. This was the main event. The arrogant, untouchable golden boy who had confidently declared just yesterday that he was going to be a millionaire had completely evaporated. In his place was a terrified little boy whose house of cards had just caught fire and the doors were locked from the outside. His messages chronicled his exact humiliating descent into absolute panic. He had marched into the Sterling estate on Friday morning, undoubtedly expecting to bully Thomas into extending the deadline or waiving the fee entirely. But Thomas was executing my orders flawlessly. The imaginary system glitch was over. The hard deadline had arrived. Jamal's texts started off annoyed, insisting that I send the wire transfer immediately because the venue staff was being uncooperative. 2 hours later, the texts grew frantic. He admitted that he had tried to run all 4 of his credit cards again, and every single one of them had hard declined in front of the front desk staff. He had tried to write a personal check, which Thomas had flatly refused to accept. He had tried to contact Chloe's father to access the supposed offshore commercial funds, but the man was mysteriously unreachable by phone. I leaned back against the edge of the infinity pool, letting the warm water ripple around my shoulders as I scrolled down to the very bottom of the thread. The facade was entirely gone. His punctuation was frantic, his spelling sloppy, his ego completely shattered. The arrogant brother who had mocked my business was officially drowning in his own lies. I read his final 10 messages, all sent in rapid succession over the last 45 minutes. Zuri, please, my card declined. Chloe is crying. They won't set up the ballroom. Wire the money, please. I stared at the glowing screen, soaking in every single word. The image of Jamal sweating in the lobby of my building, realizing he had absolutely zero leverage, was intoxicating. Chloe, the woman who had demanded I sit by the kitchen doors, was throwing a tantrum because her stolen fairy tale was evaporating into thin air. They were trapped. They had no money, no venue, and no way to hide their bankruptcy from the elite guests they had invited to witness their fake royalty. I locked my phone, set it gently back onto the patio table, and closed my eyes against the bright Bali sun. I did not type a reply. I did not transfer a single dime. Jamal had dug this grave with his own 2 hands, and now he was going to have to lie in it. I watched the 3 little gray dots bubble up on the screen and vanish over and over. Jamal was typing, deleting, and retyping his panic. The cool, sleek surface of my phone felt heavy with his desperation. Here I was, floating in a temperature-controlled infinity pool, overlooking the vast, endless expanse of the Indian Ocean, while my brother was suffocating in the shallow puddle of his own financial ruin. The tropical breeze carried the sweet scent of frangipani and sea salt, a stark contrast to the stale, recycled air of the hotel lobby I knew Jamal was currently pacing. He sent another rapid-fire message. "Zuri, please. Thomas is threatening to lock the ballroom doors. Chloe's mother is asking questions. Just wire the 75,000. I will pay you back with interest after the honeymoon. I swear." I let out a slow, deep breath, sinking lower into the heated water until it grazed my collarbone. The sheer audacity of his request was almost impressive. $75,000. He tossed the number around as if he were asking me to spot him $20 for a quick lunch. He had spent his entire adult life siphoning resources from our parents, draining their retirement accounts and leveraging their home. And now, when his well was completely dry, he expected me to casually fund his fraudulent lifestyle from across the globe. He truly believed that his status as the golden son entitled him to my hard-earned capital without question. I lifted my wet hand from the water, grabbed a plush, monogrammed towel from the edge of the stone deck, and dried my fingers meticulously. I unlocked the screen. It was time to put him out of his misery. Or more accurately, it was time to lock him inside of it. I opened our message thread. I did not type out a furious paragraph detailing his betrayals. I did not gloat about his declining credit cards or mock his crying bride. I did not mention the stolen retirement funds or the federal tax liens. That would have given him a warning. That would have allowed him to brace for impact or attempt to control the narrative. Instead, I gave him exactly what he wanted. I played the part of the obedient, reliable, helpful sister one last spectacular time. My fingers tapped against the glass screen, composing the message with absolute chilling calm. "Don't panic," I typed, keeping my tone light, accommodating, and completely reassuring. "I know things are stressful right now, but I took care of it before I left. I left a special gift with the venue manager. Thomas has it in his safe. It will take care of absolutely everything. Focus on your bride. Have a beautiful wedding." I read the message over twice to ensure it hit the exact right note. It was a masterpiece of double meaning. It promised a resolution but left the actual nature of that resolution entirely ambiguous. To a narcissist currently drowning in inescapable debt, a special gift left in a venue manager's safe could only mean one thing. He would assume it was a certified cashier's check, a thick stack of bundled cash, or a signed financial guarantee authorizing the venue to charge my accounts. His unyielding greed would completely blind him to any other possibility. He would not question why I left it with Thomas instead of handing it to him directly. He would only see the lifeline being thrown his way. I pressed send. The little blue bubble shot upward, delivering the payload. I did not even have time to set the phone back down on the patio table before the 3 typing dots appeared. Jamal was practically hovering over his screen. Less than 10 seconds later, his reply illuminated the display. It was a relentless string of emojis. 5 praying hands, 4 red hearts, and a crying face, followed immediately by a frantic burst of text. "Zuri, I literally love you so much. You are an absolute lifesaver. I knew you would come through for me. I told Chloe you were just being dramatic about the flight and that you would handle the deposit. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I am going to have Thomas bring it to the head table tonight so everyone can see." I stared at the message, a dark, deeply satisfied smile spreading across my face. He had taken the bait flawlessly. He had swallowed the hook, the line, and the sinker. He actually believed he had successfully manipulated me from 10,000 miles away. In his mind, he had won. He had secured his lavish, over-the-top party, he had silenced his demanding, high-maintenance bride, and he had successfully preserved his fake millionaire aesthetic for the country club elite. The signature arrogance had returned instantly. The terrified begging boy from 5 minutes ago was gone, instantly replaced by the entitled groom who believed the world owed him a massive favor. I could picture the scene perfectly. He was likely sprinting back to Chloe right now, shoving the phone in her tear-stained face, bragging about how he had handled his difficult, stubborn sister. He would assure his fraudulent in-laws that the minor banking glitch was resolved. He would strut into the venue, with his chest puffed out, completely unaware that he was strutting directly onto a landmine. I tapped the screen one final time, switching the device firmly back into airplane mode. I had delivered my lines. My role in this ridiculous production was officially over. I placed the dark screen face down on the teak table, leaned back against the cool stone edge of the infinity pool, and closed my eyes. The balmy Indonesian sun warmed my face, melting away the last residual traces of tension in my shoulders. I had 2 full weeks in this private paradise, and I fully intended to enjoy every single second of it. Meanwhile, the hours ticked by. The sun slowly set over the Indian Ocean, casting brilliant streaks of violet, magenta, and gold across the sky. On the other side of the world, a new day was dawning. The wedding day had officially arrived. In my hometown, the morning air would be thick with frantic, high-stakes preparations. Yolanda would be barking sharp orders at terrified makeup artists, ensuring every single hair on her head was perfectly sprayed into submission. Calvin would be nervously double-checking his bank accounts, desperately praying Jamal's promised real estate investments would somehow magically materialize. Chloe would be slipping into a custom-designed gown she absolutely could not afford, preparing to walk down the aisle toward a man whose entire existence was a carefully constructed mirage. And at the Sterling estate, the grand ballroom would be immaculate. The massive crystal chandeliers would be polished to a blinding shine, catching the light and casting fractured rainbows across the imported marble floors. The tables would be draped in heavy premium silk linens, adorned with towering floral centerpieces that cost more than my parents' mortgage payment. The silver cutlery would be perfectly aligned, waiting for the high society guests to sit down, drink the expensive champagne, and applaud the happy couple. And waiting patiently in the executive office, resting quietly inside Thomas's heavy steel safe, was the sleek matte black velvet box. Jamal had explicitly instructed Thomas to bring the gift to the head table. He wanted the grand reveal. He wanted to open the box in front of Chloe, her parents, and my parents, to prove his absolute financial dominance and solidify his status as the wealthy provider. He was going to orchestrate his own public execution, and he was going to do it willingly with a massive smile on his face. The trap was set. The venue was primed. The audience was taking their seats. Jamal thought he had manipulated the ultimate victory, but he had absolutely no idea that his special gift was a ticking time bomb, and the timer had just hit 0. The evening air in Uluwatu was an absolute sensory masterpiece. The tropical heat had softened into a thick, fragrant warmth, carrying the heavy scent of blooming frangipani and the crisp, salty tang of the Indian Ocean. I sat cross-legged on my plush outdoor lounger, wearing a lightweight silk robe, listening to the rhythmic, booming crash of the waves against the limestone cliffs directly below my private villa. The profound, impenetrable peace of my surroundings was the perfect counterpoint to the absolute carnage I was about to witness. I reached across the small teak side table, moved my frosted margarita glass to the side, and pulled my laptop onto my lap. I adjusted the screen brightness against the darkening Indonesian sky and opened a secure encrypted web browser. Thomas, proving exactly why he was the highest-paid venue manager in the city, had sent me a direct IP link earlier that afternoon. I typed in the complex alphanumeric password and hit enter. Instantly, the high-definition security feed from the Sterling Estate's grand ballroom materialized on my screen. It was early evening here in Bali, which meant it was prime reception hour back in Seattle. The timing was flawless. I maximized the video window, utilizing the camera's pan and tilt functions to get a comprehensive view of the sprawling space. The ballroom looked spectacular, a visual monument to extreme wealth that absolutely no one currently sitting in that room actually possessed. The massive crystal chandeliers cast a golden, buttery light over the heavy silk tablecloths, the gold-rimmed charger plates, and the towering, obnoxious floral arrangements Chloe had demanded. I dragged my cursor across the screen, zooming in on the head table. It was time to observe the charade. Chloe's family was a magnificent study in unearned superiority. Her father, the disgraced former commercial real estate broker, who currently owed the federal government more money in back taxes than he could legally earn in a lifetime, was swirling a glass of my venue's most expensive reserve scotch. He sat with his chest puffed out, radiating the stiff, arrogant posture of a man who firmly believed his bloodline alone made him untouchable royalty. He looked down his nose at the waitstaff, dismissing them with sharp, impatient flicks of his wrist as they refilled his water glass. Chloe's mother sat rigidly beside him, wearing a sour, pinched expression, her eyes visually dissecting the room, as if actively searching for flaws to complain about later. They were professional parasites, feeding eagerly off the illusion of my brother's non-existent success. And then there were my parents. The sight of Yolanda and Calvin sitting adjacent to their new in-laws made my stomach churn with a potent mixture of disgust and profound pity. They were practically vibrating with nervous energy, desperate to maintain the fragile illusion that they belonged at this table. Yolanda's smile was stretched so tight across her face, it looked physically painful. She was nodding enthusiastically at every single word Chloe's mother said, leaning in entirely too far, laughing entirely too hard, and visibly shrinking her entire personality to fit into the tiny acceptable box her new white in-laws required. Calvin was not faring much better. He was sitting stiffly, continuously tugging at the collar of his custom tuxedo, attempting to project the image of a wealthy, established patriarch while visibly sweating under the immense pressure of the charade. He kept trying to engage Chloe's father in conversations about investment portfolios and market trends, completely unaware that the man he was trying to impress had lost his trading license half a decade ago for investor fraud. For my entire life, Yolanda and Calvin had demanded I make myself smaller so Jamal could look bigger. They had explicitly ordered me to hide my accomplishments, to downplay my corporate income, and to literally change my natural hair so I would not outshine my brother or offend his fragile status-obsessed bride. They had told me that my independence was a liability and that my role was to quietly support the men in the family. They were perfectly willing to serve my dignity up on a silver platter just to buy their way into this specific social circle. Seeing them now groveling and bowing for the approval of broke fraudsters was the ultimate poetic vindication. I moved the camera feed slightly to the left and focused directly on the groom. Jamal was the exact picture of a man who believed he had just successfully cheated the executioner. He looked slightly sweaty, his forehead glistening under the bright ballroom lights, but the frantic, panicked energy that had radiated from his earlier text messages was completely gone. He was leaning back in his chair, one arm draped casually over Chloe's shoulders, holding court with his groomsmen at the adjacent table. He was laughing loudly, his mouth open wide, throwing back a shot of premium tequila. He was utterly relieved. In his narrow, incredibly arrogant mind, he had successfully manipulated his difficult, stubborn sister from 10,000 miles away. He truly believed that the special gift resting safely in Thomas's executive office was a massive stack of cash or a certified bank draft. He thought the massive venue bills were paid. He thought the crisis was permanently averted. He genuinely thought he could continue draining my parents dry, stealing from their retirement accounts, leveraging their home equity, and playing the wealthy venture capitalist without ever facing a single consequence. The sheer blinding hubris of it was almost magnificent to witness. I watched the digital clock on the bottom corner of the security feed. The dinner service was officially wrapping up. The waitstaff, moving with the synchronized silent precision I had personally trained them to execute, were smoothly clearing the expensive china plates from the tables. The lavish multi-course meal, funded entirely by the second mortgage Jamal had secretly taken out against my parents' family home, was over. The energy in the ballroom began to shift palpably. The low, steady murmur of conversation quieted down as the sharp clinking of silverware against crystal champagne flutes began to ripple across the room, signaling the traditional transition of the evening. Right on cue, my phone lit up on the table next to my laptop. The screen displayed a single encrypted text message from Thomas. Toasts are starting. We are in position. A slow, steady thrill cascaded down my spine, settling deep in my chest. I reached over to the small table and picked up the frosted glass pitcher my villa attendant had prepared for me. I poured myself a fresh, ice-cold margarita, the crushed ice clinking musically against the glass. I took a long, deliberate sip, the sharp, salty tang of the lime perfectly cutting through the balmy, tropical heat. I set the glass down, leaned forward, and turned the volume on my laptop all the way up. The audio feed crackled to life, instantly picking up the ambient noise of the ballroom, the soft jazz playing over the hidden speakers, and the heavy scraping sound of my father pushing his chair back to stand up. The timer was at 0. The fuse was lit. All I had to do was watch the detonation. I took a long sip of my margarita, the salt and lime grounding me in the balmy Indonesian night, while the crisp audio of a silver spoon tapping against a crystal champagne flute rang out from my laptop speakers. The ambient chatter in the Sterling Estate ballroom instantly died down. The camera feed provided a brilliant wide-angle view of the entire space, but I tapped the trackpad and zoomed directly in on the head table. Chloe's father rose from his seat. He buttoned the jacket of his rented tuxedo, puffing out his chest with the manufactured authority of a man whose commercial real estate license had been revoked for fraud half a decade ago. He picked up the microphone, a slick, practiced smile plastered across his face. He looked out over the sea of high society guests, his posture radiating the fake, unearned superiority of a seasoned con artist. "Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, friends, and the new additions to our fold," he began, his voice booming through the sound system. He paused dramatically, letting his gaze sweep across the room before settling heavily on my parents. "When Chloe first brought Jamal home, I must admit I had my reservations," he continued, his tone dripping with condescension. "We come from a very specific world. A world of legacy, of generational building, of strict standards that are simply not accessible to everyone. We have spent decades cultivating our family name, ensuring that our bloodline remains associated with nothing but the absolute finest tiers of society." I watched the screen closely, zeroing in on Yolanda and Calvin. The insult was blatant. It was a direct, unapologetic strike at my parents' background, framing them as outsiders who were fundamentally beneath the bride's family. Yet my parents did not flinch. They did not stand up. They did not defend their dignity. Yolanda sat rigidly in her chair, her manicured hands clasped tightly together on the silk tablecloth. She was actually beaming. When the man called her family inaccessible and inferior, she nodded enthusiastically, a frozen, painful smile stretched across her face. She was willingly swallowing poison and pretending it was honey, absolutely desperate to maintain the fragile illusion that she belonged at this table. Calvin was not faring any better. He sat next to her, chuckling nervously at the patronizing remarks, clapping his hands together, as if he were being complimented. They were surrendering every ounce of their self-respect just to secure a proximity to perceived white wealth. "But we are a generous family," Chloe's father declared, raising his chin higher. "We believe in charity. We believe in lifting others up from their modest beginnings." We looked at Jamal, and we saw a rough stone that just needed a little bit of high-class polishing. We saw a boy who needed proper guidance to leave his past behind. So we opened our doors. We are generously allowing him into our elite circle, and in doing so, we are elevating his family name to a level they could never have reached on their own. It was utterly revolting to witness. My parents had sacrificed my mental health, my financial stability, and my basic dignity just to buy a front-row seat to their own public humiliation. They were being openly mocked, called charity cases, by a man who secretly owed the federal government hundreds of thousands of dollars in back taxes, and they were clapping for the privilege. I moved the camera feed slightly to the right and focused directly on the groom. Jamal was sitting beside Chloe, looking slightly flushed under the bright ballroom lights, but completely satisfied. He adjusted his silk tie and flashed a brilliant, arrogant smile. He was entirely oblivious to the devastating insult that had just been hurled at our parents. In his narrow, narcissistic mind, he had already secured his wealthy future. He had successfully manipulated his difficult, stubborn sister from 10,000 miles away. He truly believed that the massive venue bills were paid in full and that his carefully constructed facade was permanently safe. He glanced toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom, his knee bouncing with eager anticipation. He was waiting for his special gift. He was waiting for the grand public display of my submission, assuming Thomas was about to march down the aisle and hand him a certified cashier's check or a thick stack of cash. He thought he had won the game. He was just waiting for his crown. To the merging of two dynasties, Chloe's father projected into the microphone, his voice echoing through the massive space. He raised his crystal flute high into the air, the glass catching the brilliant light of the overhead chandeliers. May our rich traditions guide this new couple into a prosperous, wealthy future. Cheers. The guests began to murmur their agreements. Hundreds of crystal glasses were lifted into the air. Chloe smiled brilliantly, reaching out to grasp Jamal's hand. Before a single guest could take a sip of champagne, a loud, heavy thud echoed through the audio feed. The massive solid oak double doors at the very back of the ballroom were thrust open with violent, deliberate force. The sound was so sharp and unexpected that several guests physically jumped in their seats. The soft, ambient jazz music playing over the hidden speakers was abruptly cut off by the sound engineer, plunging the massive, crowded room into absolute suffocating silence. Every single head in the ballroom turned toward the entrance. Thomas stepped through the threshold. He was dressed in his impeccable tailored management suit, his posture rigid, his face a mask of absolute lethal professionalism. He did not look like a venue manager delivering a generous wedding gift. He looked like an executioner stepping onto the block. Flanking him on either side, walking with synchronized heavy military steps, were two massive broad-shouldered security guards. Their presence instantly completely changed the entire atmosphere of the room. The joyous elite celebration evaporated instantly, replaced by a tense, breathless standoff. Thomas marched straight down the center aisle, his hard leather shoes echoing loudly against the polished marble floor before he hit the plush carpet. He kept his eyes locked dead ahead, staring directly at the head table. Resting perfectly in the center of a highly polished silver serving tray held securely in Thomas's hands was the sleek, matte black velvet box. The crushed midnight velvet absorbed the light of the chandeliers, looking incredibly heavy, impossibly expensive, and utterly mysterious. I leaned closer to my laptop screen, my heart beating a steady, victorious rhythm against my ribs. The silence in the ballroom was deafening. Chloe's father slowly lowered his crystal flute, the smug, arrogant smile sliding right off his face, replaced by a look of deep confusion. Yolanda and Calvin stared down the center aisle, their eyes wide, completely paralyzed by the sudden disruption of their perfect high society debut. Jamal leaned forward in his chair. His arrogant grin expanded into a look of absolute, unmitigated triumph. He squeezed Chloe's hand, whispering something in her ear, his chest puffed out with pride. He stared hungrily at the black velvet box approaching his table, completely unaware that the timer had just hit 0. Thomas moved through the sprawling, opulent space with the lethal precision of a highly paid assassin. He did not rush, nor did he hesitate. Every single step he took down the center aisle of the grand ballroom was measured, commanding, and heavy with purpose. The two massive security guards flanking him walked in perfect synchronization, their hands folded neatly behind their backs, their faces carved from stone. The guests seated at the tables closest to the aisle instinctively pulled their chairs in, parting like the Red Sea, to allow the dark procession to pass. The atmosphere in the room had shifted violently. A second ago, it was a warm, elite celebration dripping with champagne and fake prestige. Now the air felt thin, sharp, and highly pressurized. I sat on my patio in Bali, thousands of miles away, completely captivated by the glowing screen of my laptop. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, ignoring the gentle tropical breeze rustling through the palm trees above me. I did not want to miss a single micro-expression. Thomas stopped dead in the center of the polished dance floor, directly in front of the head table. He stood tall, holding the heavy, polished silver serving tray perfectly level. Resting perfectly in the center of that tray was the sleek, matte black velvet box. It looked like an artifact, something ancient and dangerous, absorbing the brilliant golden light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. At the head table, the fake royalty had completely frozen. Chloe's father, who had been standing with his crystal flute raised high in the air, slowly lowered his arm. The arrogant, pompous smile that had been plastered across his face just moments before began to curdle into a look of deep, profound confusion. He glanced from Thomas to the security guards, and finally down to the black velvet box. In his world of country clubs and shady backroom deals, security guards meant money. He immediately assumed this was a high-level transport of something incredibly valuable. Calvin and Yolanda were practically vibrating in their seats. My mother leaned forward, her eyes darting between Thomas and the velvet box. I could see the exact moment the realization hit her. She recognized Thomas as the venue manager I had hired. She knew I had been the one funding the initial deposits. A look of overwhelming, sickening relief washed over her face. She reached out and grabbed Calvin's arm, squeezing it tightly. In her mind, the crisis was over. She truly believed that her stubborn, difficult daughter had finally buckled under the pressure of family duty. She thought I had arranged a grand public display of financial submission to save my brother's reputation. She looked incredibly proud, ready to bask in the reflected glory of the massive check she assumed was inside that box. Thomas did not acknowledge their shifting expressions. He did not offer a polite, congratulatory smile. He reached out with one hand, bypassed the silver tray, and picked up the wireless microphone resting on the head table directly in front of Chloe's father. He did not whisper. He did not lean in to speak privately to the groom. He held the microphone up, his posture perfectly rigid, and spoke clearly into it, ensuring his voice carried through the massive state-of-the-art sound system and reached every single corner of the silent ballroom. "Excuse the interruption," Thomas announced. His voice was smooth, deep, and completely devoid of warmth. It echoed sharply against the marble floors and high ceilings. "A special wedding gift for the groom from his sister Zuri. She insisted it be opened immediately in front of your esteemed guests to commemorate this merger of dynasties." The absolute silence that followed his words was deafening. You could have heard a single pin drop on the thick carpet. Then a ripple of hushed, excited whispers swept through the room. The wealthy, status-obsessed guests absolutely loved a grand theatrical display of wealth. They leaned toward each other, their eyes locked on the black velvet box, speculating on what kind of extravagant treasure required an armed escort and a public announcement. Diamonds bearer bonds, the deed to a new luxury estate. Chloe's father puffed his chest out again, his arrogant smile returning in full force. He looked around the room, nodding approvingly at the guests, clearly taking Thomas's words as a personal compliment. He loved the phrase merger of dynasties. He believed my gift was a direct tribute to his family's supposed superiority, a massive financial offering to thank him for allowing Jamal into their elite circle. He raised his glass slightly in Thomas's direction, silently accepting the tribute. But Jamal's reaction was the true masterpiece. I dragged 2 fingers across my laptop trackpad, zooming the camera feed entirely onto my brother's face. He looked absolutely euphoric. The sheen of nervous sweat that had covered his forehead earlier was gone, replaced by a radiant, blinding glow of pure greed. He sat up completely straight, pushing his shoulders back. He looked like a king who had just conquered a rebellious territory. In Jamal's narcissistic, deeply entitled reality, my message had been literal. He truly, genuinely believed that I had wired the $75,000 to Thomas, and that Thomas had taken the liberty of presenting the receipt or a massive cashier's check in a decorative box to make the moment special. He thought I had saved him. He thought he had successfully manipulated me from across the globe, forcing me to fund his fraudulent lifestyle without ever facing a single consequence. He felt invincible. He turned to look at Chloe. The bride was practically vibrating out of her chair. Her eyes were wide, fixed hungrily on the velvet box. She licked her lips, her manicured fingers digging sharply into Jamal's tuxedo jacket. She had spent the entire morning screaming at him about declined credit cards and locked ballroom doors, but now seeing the armed guards and the velvet presentation, her anger had completely evaporated. She was ready to be rich. She was ready to secure the massive unearned payout she felt she was owed for marrying into our family. Jamal stood up. He buttoned his jacket with a smooth, practiced motion, playing the role of the wealthy, unbothered patriarch to absolute perfection. He gave a slight dismissive nod to his groomsmen, soaking in their envious stares before turning back to Thomas. He reached out across the silk tablecloth. His hands were moving quickly, betraying his desperate greed. He did not say thank you. He did not acknowledge Thomas as a human being. He simply snatched the black velvet box off the silver serving tray with a sharp, entitled jerk. Thomas immediately stepped back, his expression completely blank, allowing the groom to take center stage. The two security guards shifted their stances slightly, crossing their arms over their chests, their eyes scanning the room. They were not there to protect the gift. They were there to protect the venue from the fallout of what was about to happen. Jamal held the heavy box in his hands. He turned slightly, making sure the angle was perfect, so Chloe, her parents, and the entire room could witness the opening. Yolanda was leaning so far forward, she was practically hovering over her dinner plate, her eyes shining with tears of absolute pride. Calvin was grinning, nodding his head slowly, fully expecting to see a piece of paper that proved his son was a millionaire. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my margarita. The cold rim of the glass pressed against my lips as I watched the screen. My heart was completely steady. There was no guilt. There was no hesitation. There was only the cold, clinical satisfaction of a perfectly executed strategy. Jamal hooked his thumbs under the base of the box and rested his index fingers against the small, polished silver latch at the front. Chloe leaned in even closer, her shoulder pressing hard against his, a greedy, expectant smile stretching widely across her face. She was holding her breath, waiting for the diamonds, the cash, the keys to her new, fake life. Jamal popped the latch. The small, sharp click of the metal mechanism was completely silent on my audio feed, masked by the ambient noise of the room, but the physical movement was undeniable. He lifted the heavy velvet lid, pulling it back on its hinges, exposing the interior of the box to the harsh, bright light of the chandeliers above. I leaned closer to my screen, my eyes locked relentlessly on his face. For a fraction of a second, Jamal's confident, arrogant smile remained plastered in place. His brain was actively fighting to process the visual information in front of him. He was expecting a check with a massive string of zeros. He was expecting salvation. But what he saw shattered his reality into a million jagged, irreparable pieces. The transition was violent. It did not happen slowly. The smug, triumphant grin literally dropped off his face, melting away as if his facial muscles had suddenly been severed. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw went completely slack, his mouth falling open in a silent gasp. His eyes widened until they were entirely rimmed in white, darting frantically over the contents of the box. His hands began to shake violently, the heavy velvet box trembling in his grip. He looked like a man who had just opened a vault expecting gold only to find a loaded gun pointed directly at his chest. Absolute visceral terror consumed his features. He was no longer a wealthy venture capitalist. He was no longer the golden son. He was a cornered animal who had just realized that the cage door was locked and the walls were rapidly closing in. The bright golden light from the towering crystal chandeliers overhead flooded the interior of the matte black velvet box the exact second Jamal popped the silver latch. Through the high-definition security feed on my laptop screen, I watched the stark, uncompromising reality of his situation wash over him. He had ripped the lid back with the frantic, greedy energy of a man expecting instant salvation. He was fully prepared to see a certified cashier's check bearing my signature, a stack of crisp bills, or a signed financial guarantee that would magically erase the crippling debt he had accumulated. He was ready to wave his financial dominance in the faces of his new high society and laws. Instead, the harsh light illuminated a thick, neatly organized stack of standard legal-sized white paper. Jamal's confident, arrogant smirk did not fade slowly. It was violently severed from his face, dropping away in a fraction of a second to reveal a mask of absolute visceral terror. The color completely drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray that contrasted sharply with his dark tuxedo. His jaw went slack, his mouth hanging open in a silent, jagged gasp. I watched his eyes widen until they were perfectly round, darting frantically across the bold black text printed across the very top page. It was a notice of intent to foreclose. It was not a notice for his own apartment, which he had long since abandoned to dodge creditors. It was the official, heavily stamped legal notice directed specifically at his new father-in-law. It detailed the exact catastrophic amount of back taxes owed to the federal government, the extensive penalties, and the final unyielding deadline before the state seized their sprawling, supposedly historic family estate. Jamal's hands began to shake with such violent intensity that the heavy velvet box rattled audibly against the edge of the silver serving tray. His eyes darted from the foreclosure notice down to the secondary documents neatly paperclipped beneath it. I had been meticulous in my compilation. He was staring directly at a comprehensive stack of highlighted bank statements. They were Calvin and Yolanda's joint retirement and savings accounts. The statements chronicled years of careful conservative saving by our parents, followed immediately by massive unauthorized withdrawals. The highlighted exit transfers perfectly matched the exact dates and amounts Jamal had required to pay off Chloe's family's quiet debts fund her extravagant lifestyle and maintain his fraudulent venture capitalist aesthetic. The documents were irrefutable proof that Jamal had never been a millionaire. He was a thief who had systematically drained his middle-class parents dry to buy his way into a broke, desperate family of social climbers. And the venue bill was still entirely unpaid. The primal instinct for survival finally kicked in. Jamal's entire body tensed, his shoulders hiking up to his ears, as sheer panic flooded his nervous system. In his deeply narcissistic mind, damage control was the only remaining option. If no one else saw the papers, he could still construct a lie. He could claim it was a prank, a fake contract, a misunderstanding. He threw his weight forward, his hands moving to slam the heavy velvet lid shut and bury the evidence of his total ruin. He was entirely too slow. Chloe was sitting directly beside him, her entire body buzzing with the anticipation of a massive payout. She had spent the entire morning screaming at makeup artists, crying over declined credit cards, and throwing tantrums about the locked ballroom doors. Jamal had promised her that his wealthy sister had handled everything, that the money was secured, and that this velvet box held their financial future. When she saw Jamal's face drain of color, and when she saw his sudden frantic movement to hide the contents of the box from her, her extreme entitlement completely overrode her desire to maintain a graceful aesthetic. She firmly believed he was trying to hide a massive check or a box of diamonds from her. With a sharp, entirely ungraceful movement, Chloe lunged across the silk tablecloth. Her custom-designed, incredibly expensive wedding gown rustled loudly against the chairs as she threw her upper body over Jamal's arm. Her manicured claws dug sharply into his wrist, her grip relentless, and entirely devoid of the elegant high society manners her father had just been bragging about. A crude, desperate physical struggle broke out directly at the head table. Jamal hissed something under his breath, his face twisting with panic as he tried to yank the velvet box out of her reach. But Chloe was fueled by pure, unadulterated greed. She planted her elbow hard into his ribs, leveraged her weight, and violently snatched the thick stack of papers right out of the velvet casing. The sudden aggressive movement sent the empty box clattering onto the marble floor. The sharp noise cracked like a whip through the silent ballroom. Chloe fell back into her chair, her chest heaving, clutching the stolen documents tightly in both hands. She was breathing heavily, a triumphant, greedy smirk stretching across her face as she prepared to count her unearned wealth. She lifted the papers up to the light, her eyes focusing on the bold text of the top document. I watched the exact moment her fabricated reality completely disintegrated. Her victorious smirk shattered. The arrogant, untouchable posture she had maintained all evening vanished instantly. Her eyes locked onto the bold lettering of the notice of intent to foreclose. She recognized her parents' exact legal address, printed in stark black ink. She read the staggering, insurmountable dollar amount her father owed the federal government. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. Her family's wealth, the very foundation of her identity, and her primary weapon of superiority, was a complete humiliating lie. And now the proof was resting directly in her hands. A loud, sharp gasp tore from her throat. It was a ragged, high-pitched sound of pure shock that cut cleanly through the heavy tension in the room. Her hands began to tremble so violently that the papers ruffled audibly against each other. Her eyes darted wildly, scanning the second page. The bank statements. She saw Calvin and Yolanda's names printed at the top of the financial records. She saw the massive, unauthorized withdrawals. Her eyes tracked the highlighted lines matching the stolen funds directly to the down payments on her luxury cars, the deposits on her designer clothes, and the secret payoffs to her father's creditors. The absolute unmitigated horror washed over her features. She looked at Jamal, her mouth opening and closing, without producing a single sound. The man sitting beside her was not a venture capitalist. He was not a millionaire capable of funding her elite lifestyle. He was a broke, desperate fraud who had stolen his parents' life savings just to rent her affection. He was a financial anchor, and he was currently dragging her directly to the bottom of the ocean. Chloe dropped the stack of papers onto the table as if the crisp white sheets had suddenly caught fire. The physical struggle and the resulting sharp gasp had shattered the polite silence of the room. The illusion of a perfect elite dynasty merging together was officially broken. The guests seated in the front rows, the wealthy socialites and the country club elite, had witnessed the entire crude altercation. They had seen the groom violently panic. They had seen the bride physically wrestle him for a box. They had seen the look of absolute soul-crushing horror on her face when she read the contents. A low, urgent wave of murmurs immediately broke out across the ballroom. The whispers spread rapidly from table to table, buzzing with scandalous curiosity. Guests were leaning in close to one another, pointing discreetly at the head table, their eyes wide with judgment. The carefully curated, highly expensive aesthetic was collapsing in real time. At the adjacent tables, the parents were frozen in varying states of shock. Yolanda's painfully tight, eager smile had completely vanished. She was gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white, staring at her son with a look of desperate confusion. Calvin had half risen from his chair, his custom tuxedo pulling uncomfortably across his shoulders, completely unsure of how to handle the sudden, humiliating breakdown of decorum. Chloe's father, who had been standing with his crystal flute raised in a pompous toast just seconds ago, slowly lowered his arm. The color drained from his face as he watched his daughter drop the papers. He recognized the distinct red stamp of the Federal Tax Authority visible on the top page from where he stood. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch suddenly looked incredibly old, incredibly tired, and completely terrified. While the entire room was entirely consumed by the unfolding psychological meltdown at the head table, while Jamal was staring at the dropped papers in paralyzed defeat, and while Chloe was hyperventilating into her hands, my general manager executed his final flawless maneuver. Thomas had not flinched during the physical altercation. He had not stepped back, nor had he attempted to intervene. He remained standing with perfect, rigid posture, a silent, imposing sentry waiting for the precise moment of maximum distraction. When Chloe dropped the papers and the front row guests erupted into urgent whispers, Thomas moved. He stepped smoothly forward, reaching down into the hollowed-out space of the empty velvet box, resting on the serving tray. With a swift, practiced motion, he lifted the false velvet bottom. Resting securely in the hidden compartment was a sleek silver iPad. Thomas pulled the device out his face, a mask of absolute lethal concentration. He did not look at Jamal, who was currently burying his face in his hands. He did not look at Chloe, who was staring in horror at her parents. He turned smoothly toward the venue's dedicated audiovisual station, built directly into the side of the grand stage, just a few feet from the head table. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and produced a thick, heavy-duty auxiliary cable. The cord was pre-wired directly into the venue's central nervous system, commanding the massive state-of-the-art soundboards and the towering digital displays. Thomas plugged the cable directly into the base of the iPad. Instantly, the massive high-definition LED screens flanking both sides of the grand ballroom flickered. The tacky, elegant gold-embossed monogram of Jamal and Chloe's intertwined initials was violently wiped from the screens, replaced by a stark, pitch-black void. The soft, ambient jazz music that had been quietly filling the room was completely cut off, plunging the massive, crowded space into an abrupt, heavy silence that drowned out the whispers. Every single face in the ballroom turned away from the disastrous scene at the head table, their attention magnetically pulled toward the towering black screens. The sudden shift in lighting and audio commanded absolute authority. Thomas stood perfectly still in front of the entire assembly, holding the iPad securely in one hand. He raised his index finger, hovering directly over the illuminated glass screen. He tapped the screen. Thomas's finger connected with the smooth glass of the iPad. For a fraction of a second, the heavy, suffocating silence in the grand ballroom held tight. Then the venue's massive state-of-the-art surround sound system crackled to life. The audio was crisp, perfectly mixed, and painfully loud. It was not my voice echoing through the opulent space. It was Jamal's. Chloe's dad is letting me invest Mom and Dad's retirement in his new commercial project. I am going to be a millionaire, Zuri. While you are hustling for pennies, you will be begging me for a job. The recorded voice absolutely dripped with unearned arrogance. It was the exact tone he used when he thought he was untouchable, when he firmly believed he was the smartest person in the room. The audio looped the final sentence, reverberating off the crystal chandeliers, bouncing against the marble floors, and hanging heavy over the heads of the horrified guests. At the head table, the physical reaction was instantaneous. Jamal's eyes squeezed shut, his entire body shrinking inward, as if trying to physically fold in on himself and disappear. The terrified, ashen gray of his face drained into a sickening, chalky white. He knew exactly what he had just heard. He knew the entire room had heard it. I watched the live feed from my patio in Bali, taking another slow, satisfying sip of my margarita. The sweet tropical air brushed against my skin, a stark contrast to the absolute inferno I had just ignited on the other side of the planet. Yolanda sat frozen for exactly 3 seconds. Her brain, desperate to protect her carefully curated aesthetic, fought aggressively to process the audio. Mom and Dad's retirement. Her retirement. The money she had hoarded, the financial security she lorded over her friends, the very foundation of her country club's superiority. It was gone. It had not been invested in a legitimate venture. It had been handed over to the bankrupt fraudster sitting directly across from her. The illusion shattered with a visceral, physical snap. Yolanda let out a shriek. It was not a polite high society gasp. It was a raw, guttural, animalistic scream of a woman who had just lost everything she valued in the world. She lunged. She did not care about the heavy silk tablecloth. She did not care about her expensive, custom-tailored mother of the groom gown. She did not care about the hundreds of elite guests watching her. She threw her entire body across the head table, her manicured hands clawing frantically toward Jamal's throat. She took down a towering $10,000 floral centerpiece in her wake. White roses, rare orchids, and heavy crystal vases cascaded over the table. Water pooled over the gold-rimmed charger plates, soaking into the expensive linens. Jamal scrambled backward in a sheer panic. His chair tipped over, sending him crashing onto the polished floor just as Yolanda's hands violently swiped the air where his face had been. She was screaming incoherently, kicking her legs, sending silver cutlery clattering loudly to the ground. The audio recording sparked a completely different kind of violence in Calvin. The realization hit my father like a physical blow to the chest. His golden son did not just steal from him. His golden son took his life savings and handed them directly to the man sitting right next to him. Calvin turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto Chloe's father. The arrogant patriarch was already trying to push his chair back, his face slick with a sudden terrified sweat. He realized the wealthy Mark he had been draining was now fully aware of the scam. Calvin leaped up. He knocked his own chair backward and crossed the short distance in 2 massive, furious strides. His hands shot out, grabbing Chloe's father violently by the lapels of his rented tuxedo. He hauled the man completely out of his seat, lifting him onto the tips of his expensive leather shoes. "Where is my money?" Calvin roared, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his collar. "You stole my retirement. Give me my money back right now." Chloe's mother jumped out of her seat, shrieking in horror. She grabbed a full crystal flute of champagne and threw the liquid directly into Calvin's face, desperately trying to force him to release her husband. Calvin, blinded by the alcohol, stumbled backward, but he refused to let go of the tuxedo lapels. He dragged Chloe's father to the ground with him. The two older men crashed hard into a nearby guest table. The impact sent a second massive centerpiece shattering onto the marble floor. Shards of expensive glass exploded outward in a glittering, dangerous wave. Guests sitting at the adjacent tables screamed, shoving their chairs back and scrambling to get out of the way of the flying debris. The entire head table was an absolute war zone. Chloe kicked her chair back, the heavy fabric of her custom bridal gown catching on the table leg and tearing with a loud, sharp rip. She did not care about the dress. She stood over Jamal, who was currently scrambling on his hands and knees on the floor, desperately trying to evade his shrieking mother. "You are a fraud!" Chloe screamed down at him, her face contorted with unadulterated rage. The delicate, elegant bride aesthetic was completely dead. "You have absolutely nothing. You stole from your own parents to buy me a ring. You are pathetic." Jamal, finally finding his footing, scrambled up to his feet. His terror instantly morphed into a defensive, explosive anger. The humiliation of being exposed in front of his elite friends shattered his fragile ego. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger directly at Chloe's face. "Your family is completely bankrupt!" Jamal screamed back, his voice cracking loudly over the chaos of the room. "You are broke. Your father is a criminal facing federal tax evasion. You thought you hit the jackpot with me, but you are drowning in debt. You have nothing." They stood there screaming at each other over the ruined wreckage of their reception table. It was the mutual, devastating realization of two gold diggers who had aggressively dug into completely empty mines. They had both faked their wealth, they had both faked their status, and they had both scammed each other into a marriage built entirely on fraudulent foundations. The high society wedding completely devolved into a savage, full-blown brawl. Groomsmen rushed forward, shouting loudly, shoving each other as they tried to intervene and pull Calvin off Chloe's father. Bridesmaids were shrieking, lifting the hems of their heavy silk dresses, and fleeing toward the edges of the ballroom to escape the flying glass and splashing water. I watched the security feed in absolute awe. It was a masterpiece of destruction. The elite, wealthy guests who were supposed to witness a majestic merging of dynasties were completely horrified. Some were rushing toward the heavy double doors, desperate to escape the physical violence. Others, completely unable to look away from the spectacular slow-motion train wreck, were holding up their smartphones. They were recording every single second of the physical altercation. The exclusive country club aesthetic my parents had sacrificed everything for was completely dead, permanently buried under a pile of broken glass, spilled champagne, and shattered egos. Through the absolute, unfiltered carnage, my general manager remained completely unmoved. Thomas stood perfectly still at the edge of the dance floor. He was a solitary figure of icy calm in the center of a raging, violent storm. He watched Calvin wrestle with Chloe's father on the floor. He watched Yolanda grab a silver serving tray and hurl it wildly at Jamal's head. He watched the beautiful, expensive illusion burn entirely to the ground. He did not flinch. He did not call for the security guards to intervene. He simply let the consequences of their actions play out in real time. Slowly, deliberately, Thomas reached up and raised the wireless microphone to his lips one last time. The piercing shriek of audio feedback sliced through the ballroom, an ear-splitting frequency that instantly overpowered the sounds of shattering glass and shouting guests. Thomas tapped the microphone with a single manicured finger. The sharp, booming thud reverberated through the massive sound system, demanding absolute, unyielding attention. The physical brawling at the head table paused. Calvin was still gripping Chloe's father by the collar of his ruined tuxedo, breathing heavily, his face a mask of purple rage. Yolanda was frozen with a silver serving tray clutched tightly in her manicured hands. Chloe was sobbing hysterically over the torn fabric of her custom gown, while Jamal remained on his knees amid the scattered, crushed remains of the $10,000 floral centerpieces. They all turned their heads panting and desperate, looking toward the center of the dance floor. Thomas stood perfectly upright, smoothing the front of his suit jacket with his free hand. He raised the microphone back to his lips. His voice, amplified to maximum volume, rolled over the absolute wreckage of the high society reception. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas announced, his tone as cold and hard as the marble beneath his feet. "As the official executive representative of the Sterling estate, owned and operated entirely by Zuri Holdings, LLC, I have been instructed to inform you that this event is entirely unfunded." The words echoed into the cavernous ceiling. It took exactly 2 seconds for the reality to sink in. I watched the live feed from my patio, my heart soaring as I witnessed the precise moment my brother's brain fully processed the statement. Jamal stopped breathing. His hands went flat against the floor. Zuri Holdings, LLC. I did not just work a corporate job. I did not just hustle for pennies. I owned the very ground he was currently kneeling on. I owned the crystal chandeliers above his head. I owned the imported marble floors. I owned the luxury venue he had desperately tried to use to cement his fake status. He had walked right into my house and demanded I pay for the privilege of serving him. The ultimate checkmate was written plainly across his horrified, sweating face. A collective gasp swept through the remaining guests. The country club elite, the wealthy investors, and the high-profile socialites were staring at the head table with open, unapologetic disgust. The illusion of a powerful dynasty was completely dead, replaced by the pathetic reality of scammers fighting over stolen retirement funds. Thomas did not allow the shock to linger. He pressed his advantage with military precision, his voice cutting through the rising tide of murmurs. "The owner of this estate has been incredibly generous." Thomas continued, his gaze locking directly onto Jamal. "However, that generosity has officially expired. You now have 5 conditions to meet before my security team physically escorts every single one of you out of this building." Thomas raised his hand, ticking off the conditions on his fingers. His delivery was brutal, clinical, and completely devoid of empathy. Condition 1. Put your drinks down. You are no longer authorized to consume inventory on this property. Across the ballroom, dozens of wealthy guests sheepishly placed their expensive crystal champagne flutes and highball glasses back onto the silk tablecloths. No one dared to take another sip. Condition 2, Thomas barked. Leave the centerpieces and the decor exactly where they are. Any attempt to remove property from this estate will be treated as active theft and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Condition 3. Do not speak to my staff. You will not ask them for favors, you will not ask them for assistance, and you will certainly not direct your frustrations at them. They are instructed to ignore you entirely. Thomas took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between the dance floor and the ruined head table. Calvin slowly released his grip on Chloe's father, stepping back, his hands shaking violently as the magnitude of his public disgrace washed over him. Condition 4, Thomas said, his voice dropping an octave, slicing directly into Jamal and Chloe's father. You will pay your heavily overdue invoices by Monday morning at 9 o'clock. If the remaining balance is not wired to our accounts by that exact time, our legal counsel will file immediate civil judgments and place liens on whatever remaining assets you have not already fraudulently leveraged. Thomas lowered his hand. He looked around the vast, silent room, making eye contact with the terrified, humiliated guests. Condition 5, get off my property. You have exactly 10 minutes. Thomas dropped his arm, signaling the men behind him. The 2 massive security guards instantly stepped forward. Simultaneously, the heavy double oak doors at the back of the ballroom were thrust open by a dozen more uniformed security personnel. They marched into the room in a highly organized formation, fanning out along the perimeter of the walls, their hands resting firmly on their belts. The aesthetic of the elite, untouchable social event completely imploded. The guests scrambled. It was a mass, undignified exodus. Wealthy socialites hiked up their expensive gowns, abandoning their half-eaten dinners and grabbing their clutch purses. Men in tailored tuxedos shoved past each other, power walking down the center aisle, completely desperate to avoid being associated with the fraudulent disaster unfolding at the front of the room. They fled toward the valet stands like rats abandoning a rapidly sinking ship. I adjusted the camera angle, keeping the frame perfectly centered on the core four left behind in the wreckage. Chloe was hyperventilating, her makeup smeared across her face in dark, ugly streaks. She was screaming at her parents, demanding to know if the foreclosure notices were real, while her father stared blankly at the shattered glass on the floor, completely defeated. Yolanda had collapsed into her chair, her head in her hands, weeping loudly as she realized her entire social standing, her pristine reputation, and her life savings were permanently gone. Calvin stood over Jamal, his fists clenched at his sides, looking at his golden son with a mixture of absolute disgust and profound betrayal. And Jamal remained on the floor. The golden boy was completely hollowed out. His carefully constructed mirage was burned to ash. He had no money, no venue, no wealthy bride, and no family left to manipulate. He was exposed, ruined, and entirely alone. I watched them for one final, deeply satisfying minute. The chaotic symphony of their consequences was the sweetest music I had ever heard. There was no guilt in my chest. There was no lingering sense of familial obligation. There was only the absolute pristine clarity of justice. I reached forward and closed my laptop. The screen went black, cutting off the fluorescent glow of the ballroom. The transition was instant. The screaming, the crying, and the sharp commands of the security guards were immediately replaced by the soothing, rhythmic sound of the Indian Ocean crashing against the limestone cliffs below my villa. The warm, fragrant Bali breeze washed over my face, carrying the scent of sea salt and blooming jasmine. I leaned back into the plush cushions of my cabana, looking up at the vast, endless canopy of stars stretching across the southern hemisphere. Exactly 5 minutes later, the sleek black phone resting on the teak table beside me began to vibrate. The screen illuminated the darkness of the patio. It was Jamal. I picked up the device, swiped my thumb across the glowing green icon, and lifted the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I just listened. Through the speaker, the sound of absolute, unmitigated ruin poured into the tropical night. Jamal was sobbing. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. He was taking massive, ragged gasps of air, hyperventilating, his voice cracking with sheer visceral panic. In the background, the sharp, wailing cries of Yolanda echoed through the audio, accompanied by Calvin shouting furiously at the venue's security guards who were actively forcing them toward the exits. "Zuri!" Jamal choked out, his voice practically unrecognizable through the thick layer of snot and tears. "Zuri, please, please, you have to fix this. They are kicking us out. Chloe left, her parents left. Dad is saying he's going to disown me. I have nothing. I have absolutely nothing. You have to wire the money. Please, I am begging you. I will do anything. You cannot leave me like this." He was begging for salvation from the very sister he had spent a lifetime diminishing. He was demanding a life raft from the woman he had tried to drown. I looked out over the dark, sprawling expanse of the ocean. A calm, easy smile spread across my face. "I told you I would pay for the open bar, Jamal," I said. My voice was light as air, floating effortlessly through the phone line, carrying absolutely zero trace of anger or resentment. "I just didn't say how long it would stay open. Have a great honeymoon." "Zuri, wait please." I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the bright red button to end the call. The line went instantly dead. My fingers moved with practiced, effortless speed. I opened his contact profile, scrolled down to the very bottom of the screen, and tapped the block button. I did the exact same thing for Yolanda, and then I did the exact same thing for Calvin. I purged them from my network, erasing their access to my peace. I set the phone back down on the table, turning it face down against the wood. I stood up, adjusting the belt of my silk robe, feeling the cool, smooth fabric brush against my skin. I walked slowly to the edge of the stone patio, stepping off the deck and onto the warm, powdery sand of the private beach. The waves rushed forward to greet me, washing over my bare feet, pulling the sand out to sea and leaving the shore perfectly clean. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the salt air. I was finally respected. I was completely free. And for the first time in my entire life, I was entirely unbothered. The greatest lesson here is that your worth is never defined by those who fail to see it, even if they are family. True family is about respect and unconditional support, not just bloodlines. When toxic relatives attempt to diminish your light, the most powerful response isn't vengeance, but phenomenal, undeniable success. Building your own emotional and financial independence is the ultimate freedom. You don't need to beg for a seat at a table where you aren't valued. You can simply build your own. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more empowering journeys.